6 months into tax reform, a White House economic advisor says everything is exactly as expected.
The thing that surprised me the most so far is how precisely the data have come in exactly as we expected with our models in the fall.
The U.S. manufacturing sector is showing strong confidence in the wake of the tax bill and amidst trade talks.
95% optimism about the future of the economy. 77% plan to increase hiring, 86% plan to increase investment, and 72% plan on increasing wages.
But will the tax bill pay for itself by relying on a 3% GDP growth, as the White House economic advisor suggests? Mainstream economists have doubts.
In an extremely optimistic view about what the tax cuts can do to economic growth.
Yet they've been wrong more than once.
Don't forget that back when we wrote our growth forecast last fall for this year of just a little bit north of 3%, then everybody's like, oh, these guys are crazy, and now we look and everybody's forecast is above ours.
6 months after tax law, what are the facts and how will they affect you?
Welcome to Zooming In. I'm Simone Gao. In December of last year, President Trump signed the massive tax bill into law. The bill removed the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate, and it overhauled the tax code for businesses and individuals. It's been 6 months since the president signed the bill. What are American people in business saying about it? Does its ability to pay for itself depend on whether or not there will be a recession down the road? And will there be a recession during Trump's presidency? We'll take a look at these questions, as well as the most recent update on the U.S.-China trade war.
The newest Gallup polls from June 2018 show that satisfaction with the direction of where the U.S. is heading has reached a 12-year high. The findings are timely and show the effects of the Trump administration's 6-month-old tax law. According to Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, who was a main author of the bill, the polls show that the tax bill is a success. Millions of Americans have received bonuses and wage increases. 1 million jobs were created, utility rates were lowered in 48 states, and unemployment is at record lows.
Well, thanks so much, everyone, for being here.
At a June 26th Washington Post event on tax reform, Kevin Hassett, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to the White House, expressed surprise that the data is perfectly in line with what their fall models projected.
The thing that surprised me the most so far is how precisely the data have come in exactly as we expected with our models in the fall. Estimate of what would happen to structures was that it would go up 14.2%. Because of the tax bill, and it should jump immediately in the models that we use. And in the first quarter GDP, it went up 14.3%. And we thought that equipment would go up about 9%, and I think it went up 8-something%. We thought intangibles investment would go up around 11%. It went up around 11%. We said 9% for overall investment, and it was like 9.2. And so I say the biggest surprise, and I'm sure that the second quarter, it looks like, is going to be way above those numbers. But right. The real surprise for me was that the models worked, and they worked not only in the top line, but in the sort of cross-section.
A big promise of the tax reform is it would increase wages by $4,000 per average American. Kevin Hassett said America is either on the right track to achieve that, with some having already achieved it.
I mean, we thought in over 3 to 5 years that the average wage in the U.S. would go up by $4,000, and that was based on basically the capital accumulation happening that our models predicted. And so think about it. I just mentioned that the first quarter capital spending number came in precisely on expectation, and so we are on the path to get that extra money. But the thing that surprised me is how many firms looking ahead to a tight job market and a lot of higher productivity have increased wages already. And so
through bonuses or through wages?
Well, you know, bonuses and wages both, and also increased 401k contributions. But we've got, we keep track of this. We're closing in on 7 million. We're north of 6 million workers have received an average increase of $1,200. But some of those people in the database have already gotten the 4,000. And to put the 4,000 in perspective, Walmart increased the minimum wage by $2 an hour. And if a full-time worker gets a higher wage by $2 an hour, then that's pretty close. It's getting up into the high 3,000s. Let's just say it's getting closer to 4,000. And if the lowest paid guy at Walmart is already this year getting something that's within hailing frequencies of the $4,000, then it makes the $4,000 number seem pretty reasonable, right? But during the tax debate, when our analysis, which again was just math and data, was saying the 4,000 number, then you would have thought that it was a crime against humanity to assert such a thing. But the fact that the lowest paid guy at Walmart is almost getting that in the first year, when we said it'd be 3 to 5 years, it suggests that the thing's working.
Kevin Hassett was challenged on this front by Seth Hanlon from the Center for American Progress, who argued that the data says wage growth has not gone up at all from last May to this May. The discrepancy in numbers is due to a difference in data calculations. Dr. Hassett used nominal wage growth with the Employment Cost Index, whereas Hanlon adjusted numbers for a real wage growth calculation. Unlike economists who differ in models and methodology application, the reaction from the U.S. manufacturing sector is unified and simple.
So 2016, the first 5 months of the year, the manufacturing sector lost 16,000 jobs. 2017, same period, first 5 months, the manufacturing sector created around 63,000 jobs. This year, we've already created 115,000 jobs. So now, again, you could make the argument that that is just accidental. I would make the argument that there is a direct relationship between what we're seeing in the economy and what Congress and policymakers did on the tax code.
According to Arik Newhouse, a 20-year-old survey about optimism level among manufacturers also indicates high confidence in economy.
95% optimism about the future of the economy. 95%. We've been asking that question for 20 years. This is the highest number we've ever seen. 77% plan to increase hiring, 86% plan to increase investment, and 72% plan on increasing wages. So again, that kind of, the small and medium size, and we kind of answer the question more discreetly, I think about a company in Mount Vernon, Ohio, about 45, 60 miles northeast of Columbus. There's 450 employees there, 2,000 employees across the country. Ariel Corporation raised its wages by 13% this year. That's pretty powerful, and it's directly related to the tax bill.
But an organization representing workers in the communications industry sees a different picture.
You know, the stock, but when the tax bill was, when they were talking about it, employers were coming out saying that they were going to give a $4,000 wage increase. That just has not happened. It's not on the horizon to happen. We've seen, and they were going to increase jobs. We've seen jobs, for instance, one of our employers, AT&T, where we have about 110,000 people, said they were going to increase jobs by 7,000 jobs for every $1 billion in tax cut. Well, they got a $3 billion tax cut, and we've seen 6,000 layoffs since the tax cut happened.
Coming up, will the tax law pay for itself? And what's in store for the U.S. economy?
U.S. debt and spending is growing rapidly. Cutting taxes will further reduce government revenue, but it will also unlock more economic potential. Will the tax law pay for itself and make a profit? Here's Kevin Hassett's calculation.
You know, again, I think that if we grow an extra % a year, remember when we took office, the president promised 3% growth. I think we're almost certainly, I think right now, our internal models say it's about 80% that we'll have 3%, a full year of 3% once we get second quarter GDP in. That if you grow 3% instead of, say, the 2% that we inherited for 10 years, that's extra % a year. That's not just taxes, it's deregulation and whatever else we do, but a % a year that gets 10% higher GDP in the 10th year, and I guess GDP in the 10th year right now is estimated to be about 28 trillion. So you get $2.8 trillion more GDP. Or let me put it this way, so right now the deficit over 10 is about $1 trillion higher because of the big expansion of spending and because of the CBO's unwillingness to have much growth effect from the tax bill. But GDP over the next 10 years is like, what, more than 4 times higher than that, but it's about 6 times higher than that. And so would you trade $1 trillion increase in the deficit for $6 trillion more GDP? If you have a model that says you shouldn't do that, then you probably should check your model.
Dr. Hess's projection that the tax bill will pay for itself assumes that there will be several years of high growth in the future. I asked David Stockton, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He says it's unlikely the tax bill will be able to pay for itself.
So I think that's highly unlikely and an extremely optimistic view about what the tax cuts can do to economic growth. You know, a lot of economic models that we've surveyed suggest that you might get a percentage point on the level of GDP over the next 10 years. That's just 0.1% of additional growth per year. And I think that's probably more reasonable mainstream. Getting up to 3% growth would require the tax cuts to produce an enormous increase in the growth rate of productivity that just doesn't seem to be in the cards yet. And even if we got a step up in business investment spending, which I do think is likely, it's not likely to produce such an overwhelming increase in the growth rate of the economy. So I'd be thinking basically 1/10 of what Kevin Hassett suggests for additional growth. And in that case, in fact, the tax cuts will not pay for themselves. And yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office here in the United States issued a report on the longer-term budget outlook, and they too see a very substantial increase in the level of U.S. debt relative to GDP. It will rise to close to 100% by the end of the next decade, and maybe to 150% over the next 30 years, unless policies are changed in the future to rein in those deficits.
The U.S. hasn't had a 3% GDP growth for decades, that's true, but that was before President Trump took office. Will economists and the mainstream media make another economic forecast mistake, just like they did with the election? Kevin Hassett has this to say.
Don't forget that back when we wrote our growth forecast last fall for this year of just a little bit north of 3%, then everybody's like, oh, these guys are crazy. And I had economists that advised previous presidents. There was one quote that every time I went on CNN, they would play the quote, I don't have to say the person's name, where they introduced me like this on CNN because they're so collegial towards this White House, you might have noticed, that Kevin Hassett is either stupid or a liar or both. But that was over the 3% forecast. And now we look and everybody's forecast is above ours.
Mr. Hassett's projection that the high growth rate that enables the tax bill to pay for itself depends on another important factor. There will be no recession. David Stockton believes there is a high probability that in the next 10 years there will be a recession, simply because we haven't cured recession and they are going to happen again. Hassett, on the other hand, claims although the odds of there being a recession unconditionally are probably north of 50-50, no CEA has predicted one so far. Douglas Duncan, Fannie Mae's chief economist, who we interviewed a few weeks ago, echoed his opinion.
The U.S. economy is growing healthily. It's somewhere between 2.5% and 3% growth this year. The tax cut will probably offer some support for that over this year and perhaps next year. Also, the additional federal spending that was put in the budget agreement offers some support. Going beyond another year and a half and further out, we expect things to slow. Not necessarily forecasting directly a recession, but some slowdown because there's the initial impulse of the tax bill and the spending, which then wanes over time. Part of that tax bill was actually temporary, and some provisions of it expire down the road. So as those things happen, we would expect, again, some slowdown in growth.
Coming up, is China approaching its Minsky moment amid a trade war with the U.S.? On June 18th, President Trump ordered his chief negotiator, U.S. Trade Representative Robert E. Lighthizer, to identify a list of $200 billion in goods to levy a 10% tariff if China refuses to narrow the trade deficit as requested. Adding up all previous rounds of threats, this administration is aiming at $450 billion worth of goods that could be subject to tariffs. If these steps are taken, nearly all $505 billion in products that the United States imports from China would be under tariffs. China retaliated and vowed to fight back. Xi Jinping told a group of U.S. CEOs on June 25th that China would strike back by delaying licenses, holding up M&A deals, or potentially turning its 1 billion consumers against U.S. products on top of tariff increases. The trade war escalation didn't end there. President Trump explored the option to use his presidential power to restrict Chinese companies from investing in U.S. technology firms. He later decided to take a much milder measure by working with Congress to enhance the existing review process for foreign investments. However, protecting technology that's vital for U.S. security and prosperity has long been the center of focus for President Trump's trade war.
How much power does China have in retaliating against the U.S.? Much of the focus has been given to the total trade volume and the Chinese government's power to limit U.S. investments and operations in China. That's not enough. To fully understand China's retaliation power, we also need to understand its own economic condition. According to one Chinese finance scholar, trade war aside, China is reaching its Minsky moment. It's in no position to retaliate against external forces when its internal economic organs are already unstable. Let's take a look.
He Jianbing is a Chinese scholar and author of 2 books on the Chinese economy. He believes that China is facing its Minsky moment. Minsky is named after American economist Hyman Minsky, who anticipated when financial bubbles would burst. He Jianbing identified 3 factors that indicate the bubble will burst soon. Using 2016 data, China's total debt is 350% of its GDP. Any level above 200% raises major concerns. Additionally, the Chinese real estate market's total value is estimated to be between $40 trillion and $400 trillion. A large range, and yet a behemoth, even if reality falls on the most conservative spectrum of this estimation. Currency is the third area of concern. By March of this year, Chinese money supply reached 174 trillion yuan. That's larger than the U.S. and European money supply combined. The heart of the issue is still on housing. It is a segment within the Chinese market that ties up a large amount of wealth. Even with the money supply increasing, much of the liquidity isn't readily available for other segments in the economy. The Chinese economy's structural issue is that industries cannot compete with real estate on investment return. In 2017, requirements on down payments for a second home or investment property increased 60% to 80%. This shows how difficult it is to tame the market and to curb speculation and excess leverage. Earlier this month, the finance community circulated an official document entitled, "Be Warned About Financial Panic." The article was published by the Office of National Finance and Development, an entity that's recognized by the Chinese government. It identified issues of money supplies continuing to rise in May, signs of debt default rising and liquidity drying up for corporations as key concerns. The article was taken offline, and the reason cited was that it was only meant for internal discussion purposes. At least we know in the Chinese market, officials are concerned about a financial panic. Unless the housing bubble and structural issues can be resolved, China's willingness and ability to truly fight a trade war is questionable.
On June 19th, a week after Kim Jong-un's landmark summit with President Trump and amid an escalating trade conflict between China and the U.S., he returned to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping again. On July 1st, new satellite imagery indicates that North Korea is completing a major expansion of a key missile manufacturing plant. Beijing probably played a role in this, but will it deter President Trump from escalating punitive trade measures against China? Stay tuned. Zooming In will bring you unique perspectives on this and more that you won't see from anywhere else. You can find us by simply searching for Zooming In with Simone Gao. Thanks for watching and see you next week.